In 1987, I went there just as a tourist and as a mountaineer, and we were there for about a month. Didn't know hardly anything about Tibet.
We went to the Tibetan side of Everest, not trying to summit, just going to get as high as we could on Everest, and we spent a month doing this and having a blast. We hitchhiked to Lhasa. There were a lot of Chinese immigrants coming into Lhasa, and my first impression of Lhasa was actually that there were more Chinese than Tibetans. I was looking around when we got off our ride, wondering where all the Tibetans were. There was a lot of tension in Lhasa, and the Chinese were denouncing the Dalai Lama for being a splittist and trying to split the motherland, and they were blaring this on the loudspeakers that he was proposing this peace plan in Washington. 3 days later, the Chinese government in power responded by publicly executing 2 Tibetan nationals in a stadium in Lhasa, and they not only did this, they forced 15,000 people to watch this. Some monks in one of the monasteries started a demonstration. They had homemade Tibetan flags, and they were chanting "China out of Tibet" and "Free Tibet."
With the preservation of Buddhism in mind, I got up and shouted, and the monks shouted and raised their fists with me.
I was born after Tibet was lost to the Chinese. As I grew up, I realized that we were oppressed. They had wronged us and stolen our land. We Tibetan demonstrators didn't have any kind of weapons with us. We were just raising slogans, "Free Tibet." We shouted, "Long live the Dalai Lama," and read Chinese out of Tibet.
When the riots started, all the tourists were caught totally unaware. We walked into what was a massacre.
The Chinese were firing at the Tibetans the same way we light firecrackers on New Year's. They used tear gas, and the monks and the people cried. A lot of people were wounded, and many were arrested and put in the trucks. They were beaten a lot, and some of the monks were all covered in blood.
There were a number of casualties that I witnessed personally. The first was a man, dazed, carrying his son, a 10-year-old boy, in his arms. I ran up to him, saw immediately that the child had been shot in the chest, reached around to his back and saw that there was an exit wound in the back. The child literally died in my hands. There was nothing that I could do.
Tibetans just kept grabbing me to take me to someone to take their picture, someone who had been killed or injured.
As the police started shooting at the crowd, their vehicles were being overturned. The gasoline that spilled out was lit on fire. Their jeeps exploded. Smoke is pouring into the air. And before you knew it, the whole police station was going up. The prisoners at this time were taken into back rooms, and you could hear gunfire going off inside the police station. And I remember a woman screaming vividly, "They're killing our monks."
At one point we noticed a monk running into the door of the police station to try to help the monks escape who had been imprisoned, or who'd been arrested earlier that morning. And later we found out that was Champa Tenzin.
Champa Tenzin, holding hands with another monk, ran into the burning police station, made it through the first rooms, which were collapsing already, into the back rooms, was able to start enough of a fracas with the police that some people managed to escape.
About a half hour later, he came out of the building, and his arms, flesh was and skin was hanging off his arms.
He was charred, totally charred. It's the most incredible thing that I had ever seen, because he was still alive, and he was raising his hand up above his head. A woman put a white silk scarf around his neck, and he was lifted onto the shoulders of the crowd and carried through the Barkor as a hero. He was lapsing in and out of consciousness at this time because the pain was so intense for him to bear. Hundreds of people were weeping at this. You couldn't see this without crying. Champa Tenzin was taken to prison for several months after that and tortured. I'll never forget going back to the Jokang and seeing Champa Tenzin. I was amazed at how light he was, at how there was no animosity in his eyes whatsoever. Here was a man who had forgiven his captors, who had forgiven his torturers, and who had dedicated his life to the freedom of his people. After I got out of Tibet, I heard that Champa Tenzin had been killed. Monks saw Champa Tenzin with a noose around his neck. His entire face and body was beaten and bloody. He was lying on a bed, and the noose was not tied to anything. So it was very obvious that he was killed.
Tibet has been called the altar of the earth. Here in the thin air, more than 14,000 feet above sea level, surrounded by the tallest peaks on earth. The power of the divine seems present everywhere. For centuries, Tibet remained a mystery to the outside world. Legends told of a paradise on earth hidden somewhere behind the great mountains. Guarded to the south by the colossal peaks of the Himalayas. Impenetrable river gorges in the east. And huge expanses of windswept deserts across the west and north. The Great Tibetan Plateau, its peaks thrusting 5 miles into the sky, is the largest geologic feature on Earth. It is an immense territory that stretches for 1,000 miles over an area the size of Western Europe. These hard facts of geography sharply define the borders of ethnic Tibet.
When I was little, we had yaks, sheep, and horses, lots of them. They were on the hills, and the hills were full of flowers. Horses, you know horses? I loved riding horses. As I remember, all the older people would be chanting prayers all the time, and the children would be happily playing around. I don't remember any troubles. We practiced our religion, we had our rights, and we lived happily.
My youth was the happiest time of my life. I guess young people all over the world behave as we did. We danced, sang, fell in love, grew jealous, showed off, and did innumerable other silly and inconsequential things. We expressed feelings of the heart through songs, and our people seemed to have an endless store of these.
The most pleasant occasion was the time of masked dancing at the monastery. where the monks danced and all the people, young and old, came dressed in their best. We picnicked in beautiful grassy lands, and people brought all sorts of food to eat, like cheese and milk and meat. This went on for 6 or 7 days, with people dancing, singing songs, and competing in horse riding.
This awe-inspiring land gave birth to one of the most spiritual cultures the world has ever known.
Prayer was part of one's daily life. Even in the most humble tent, you would find a shrine. We in the West, of course, regard time as, I suppose, basically as something to be used. We've always got to be doing something, whereas any Tibetan would always give some time of the day set aside for prayer, for contemplation.
For thousands of years, Tibetan shamans performed rituals to appease the wrathful deities of their land and to communicate with an unseen world. 1,200 years ago, Tibet was a land of warrior kings and fierce tribes who forged a sprawling military empire which reached across much of Central and South Asia and even captured the ancient Chinese capital of Xi'an. In one of the most remarkable revolutions in human history, Tibet's fearsome armies and the bloodthirsty deities they worshipped were transformed into protectors of a faith dedicated to the pursuit of inner peace. Buddhism originated in India, where 500 years before the birth of Christ, a young prince gave up a life of riches to understand the misery and death he found outside his palace walls. After years of meditation, he announced that he had discovered a way to freedom from the endless cycles of worldly suffering. He became known as the Buddha, or Awakened One.
Buddha did not found a religion. Buddha founded an educational movement. Buddha's discovery, his enlightenment, was that human beings, if they make an effort to understand themselves, they can get rid of their negative tendencies and they can develop to an unlimited degree their positive tendencies. When they do that, they can genuinely become happy. So the Buddha's real teaching, his real announcement was that freedom is possible. I have attained it, you can attain it. Only in Tibet, and only by the 17th century, after 1,000 years of Buddhism in Tibet, did the monastery take responsibility for a government. The king disbanded the army, the king became a monk, and therefore without heredity, reincarnation became the vehicle of succession.
The Dalai Lama, whose title means Ocean of Wisdom, became the spiritual and political leader of the Tibetan nation.
The Tibetan people believe the Dalai Lama to be the embodiment of the principle of compassion, the reincarnation of a bodhisattva who has vowed to be reborn in the world to help and to guide those he has been teaching in previous lives, who is both committed to the destiny of Tibet and has worked for that over many lifetimes. Someone who sustains the whole culture of the land.
The Tibetans were a very independent people. They didn't always see eye to eye with the Lhasa government. Yet they all owed allegiance to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. They fervently believed in their God King, in their religion.
Tibet's unique form of Buddhism was propagated in the largest monastic universities the world has ever seen. Every Tibetan family had a close relative who was a monk or a nun.
85% of the national budget of Tibet was spent on supporting the curriculum of the monastic universities, and 10% of the population were in those monastic universities. This would be the equivalent in the United States as if the whole of the defense budget were put into the education budget. Enlightened people was what they were trying to produce. Of course, that doesn't mean that every Tibetan monk was enlightened. Many were not. It doesn't mean that every Tibetan was enlightened. Naturally, many were not. But it means that a very high core percentage of the educated and the highly developed ones were enlightened. This enlightenment radiates into every corner of the culture. This is why Tibetan culture is so beautiful. Tibetan culture is so inspiring to people. It has so much color. Its festivals are so marvelous, and it keeps alive primitive energy.
Even today in Tibet, you will find that religious festivals continue to go on. And many of these festivals describe the victory of Buddhism over the local indigenous religions, but not in a way that suppresses or denies those indigenous forms. They're still part of the Tibetan life.
Tibetans think of religion as a source of fun. They don't feel that God created the world to punish them and torture them. They don't feel that God created the world, period. God doesn't have power over them. Basically, the real thing that either brings them happiness or causes them trouble is their own behavior.
Tibetans have a tremendous body of spiritual knowledge, a spiritual technology, if you will, that is an immense gift to human learning. They have preserved in their monastic universities a vast corpus of learning and understanding about the nature of consciousness and the structure of the human mind that Western science is just beginning to comprehend.
Tibet's spiritual masters earned such a reputation throughout Asia for their advancements of knowledge and philosophy that leaders of neighboring empires, such as the Khans of Mongolia and the emperors of China, became disciples of Tibetan lamas. In return, the emperors protected Tibet from invasion. Tibet was able to enjoy over 700 years of relative peace and prosperity. However, it was never a utopian Shangri-La. The government was plagued by corruption and assassinations. Peasants worked estates owned by the aristocracy and the monasteries.
The standard of living of the people was low, there's no doubt about that. The Tibetans were poor, a lot of them. There was a division in society between the aristocracy, the rich, and the poor.
Tibet was not a very advanced society, but our culture and religion is very deep and sophisticated. The living standard may not have been great, but we had enough to eat, and we never had people starving to death.
Tibet's era of isolation would end with the dawn of the 20th century. After Tibet was briefly invaded by Great Britain and then China, the 13th Dalai Lama formally declared Tibet's independence. Alarmed by communist persecution of Buddhists in neighboring Mongolia, he urged his countrymen to strengthen the army, but his modernization efforts were opposed by the conservative monastic establishment. Before he died, the 13th Dalai Lama left a warning.
We must guard ourselves against the barbaric Red Communists. Otherwise, it may happen that here in the center of Tibet, religion and government will be attacked, monks and monasteries will be destroyed, all beings will be sunk in great hardship and overpowering fear.
In 1933, a young boy born to a peasant family in northeastern Tibet was recognized to be Tenzin Gyatso, the reincarnated 14th Dalai Lama. Cloistered in the Potala Palace, he excelled in his studies of Buddhist philosophy and metaphysics, while the world beyond suffered the chaos of World War II, Indian independence, and the Chinese Civil War.
Chinese have always seen Tibet as part of its imperial sphere of influence. When the emperor was on the throne, the emperor believed that his right to rule the world extended to Tibet because that was part of the world that he knew of.
The Chinese argue that there were long periods in which Tibet was ruled by officials sent from the Chinese government. On several occasions, when the Tibetans were attacked, they asked for the Chinese emperor to send an army to intervene.
Tibet has never been an independent country. It's not recognized as an independent country by any country in the world, including the United States. Tibet has been Chinese territory since mid-13th century in Yuan dynasty.
The Tibetans thought of the Chinese as a separate people. The Tibetans are not Chinese. They have their own language. I was fortunate enough to speak both Chinese and Tibetan. I can assure you there is no connection whatsoever between the two. None at all.
Tibet had its own currency, it had its own government, it had its own army. It had relations with other countries. It signed treaties with other countries. And the Tibetans argue that those signs prove that Tibet was independent and should be independent still.
Tibet merely wanted to remain in its own self-imposed isolation. They had their own way of life, their own fervent belief in their religion, and they wished to preserve that and to preserve it untainted, without outside influences. Many is the time when I travelled in eastern Tibet particularly, I would meet pilgrims on the road, prostrating themselves the whole way, measuring their length. It would take them months or even years to travel to Lhasa.
What most people don't understand is that the invasion, occupation and colonization of Tibet is recent and it's blatant. And because in most people's imagination Tibet is something very far away, very remote, the immediacy and urgency of the problem is not understood.
What the West has done is avert its eyes while genocide takes place in Tibet. One of the specific violations of international law is the forced population transfer, the driving Tibetans out of their homeland. There has been a massive relocation of Chinese into Tibet. The ethnic cleansing has been underway in Tibet for about 20 years.
For an outsider, it looks that Chinese are doing a great thing to have hospitals, schools, road, electricity in Tibet. It's very hard for a Tibetan to say that I'm a Tibetan and I want to see Tibetan culture or Tibetan religion being promoted or preserved. This may lead him to face even imprisonment.
Lhasa, which means place of the gods, now has a red light district that stretches block after block for nearly a mile, servicing the many garrisons of Chinese troops stationed in Tibet. At least 658 brothels were identified by the Tibet Information Network in 1999. The Chinese are recreating Lhasa in their own image, erecting monuments to their version of history. Entire Tibetan neighborhoods are being torn down. Historic sections of Lhasa are being replaced with Chinese apartments and department stores.
The plans show the complete eradication of the traditional Tibetan quarters of Lhasa. The big temples remain, the Jokang and the Potala, but none of the traditional areas are there anymore.
Development, it's a double-edged sword because Tibetans need development and they want development. There's incredible poverty in Tibet. The Chinese move in to do the development. So in the end, Tibetans aren't benefiting much at all.
The Tibetans clearly want modernity and its advantages. They don't want the political repression, the political violence and the cultural destruction that goes with that. The things that are problematic for Tibetans are not cars, radios, televisions, faxes, brothels, karaoke bars. The things that fundamentally affect them are the lack of any control, any access to the government, to the party, to power, to economic process, to the ability to use their language and culture to make decisions about the future.
The worst thing for a Tibetan under the Chinese rule is that one cannot say that I am a Tibetan, as simple as this.
I'd heard all the stories of torture and all the problems of Tibet. I wanted to go see it firsthand. There are cameras at certain places on top of the buildings that monitor the people. Tibetans in Tibet are not free. There is not freedom of religion in the monasteries in Tibet. Every monastery has a cadre of Chinese Public Security Bureau police that run the monastery. People came up to us throughout Tibet and asked for pictures of the Dalai Lama, and periodically some would bring a picture out and show us, but it's against the law to have a picture of the Dalai Lama.
You know, Dalai Lama has a smiling face, have a humble gestures. When he toured the world, he always make propaganda about his cause and even publish some books. He could easily deceive people. In Tibet, according to the Chinese constitution, you know, every ethnic groups in China enjoy the freedom of religion.
In 1996, Beijing launched the Strike Hard campaign, a nationwide anti-crime effort. In Tibet, the Strike Hard campaign is aimed at separatists. Monks and nuns who express loyalty to the Dalai Lama are deemed enemies of the state.
We don't want the Chinese in Tibet. We want our independence. We want our country back. The Chinese forbid us from saying that.
For Tibetans in Tibet, calling for independence is the #1 crime. The basic cry of humanity for freedom is today the #1 crime for which people have been given summary executions. And all political prisoners in Tibet are labeled criminals. And that enables them to treat them in the harshest possible manner.
Now there's a prison in Ganden, in the monastery. What the Chinese say is that it's for thieves, you know, lawbreakers. But really, it's for monks who step out of line, to jail them easily.
Sertar Buddhist Academy in eastern Tibet housed the largest concentration of monks and nuns in modern Tibet, including 1,000 ethnic Chinese students. In the spring of 2001, authorities crushed what had been a remarkable renaissance of Chinese interest in Tibetan Buddhism. In the past 7 years, an estimated 19,000 monks and nuns have been forced from their monasteries. Public displays of religious practice are permitted, but only those which communist officials perceive as non-threatening to their control. The People's Liberation Army swept Mao Zedong to power in 1949. Standing on the platform of Tiananmen Square, he declared the founding of the People's Republic of China.
The first international act of the Chinese communists on coming to power in 1949 was the invasion of Tibet.
In 1950, the People's Liberation Army crossed the upper Yangtze River and attacked the Tibetan army at the Battle of Chamdo. It was the beginning of what the Chinese called the peaceful liberation of Tibet.
Of course, China's invasion was not a peaceful liberation. These were armed troops invading another's territory. How can you call it peaceful?
Robert Ford was one of only a handful of Westerners to have lived in Tibet before the Chinese invasion. He was working as a radio operator for the Tibetan government in the city of Chamdo when the Chinese army took control.
I went out onto the balcony at the monastery. I could see the Chinese communist troops arriving. There was little I could do then other than wait for their arrival and wait to be taken prisoner, along with the Tibetans. The Tibetans were told that they were being liberated from the Anglo-American imperialists. They had no idea what an Anglo-American imperialist was, so this was completely confusing to them. The Tibetans did not have a political term for liberation, so they had to describe that they were being set free, and they all found this rather amusing, in fact. They wondered what they were being freed from, and then when it was said that from these Anglo-Americans, they would look at me and smile and say, well, you're the one, they would shout out, you're the cause of our problems, but you've never been any problem to us.
Condemned as an agent of Anglo-American imperialism, Robert Ford would spend nearly 5 years in Chinese prison. To Tibetans, liberation was a spiritual term referring to the goal of all beings to escape the suffering of material existence. Liberation could only be achieved through the cultivation of wisdom and compassion. Mao Zedong understood liberation in a very different sense.
Liberation in the vocabulary of communism and Leninism has to do with the overthrow of an exploitive economic system. And that's what the Chinese claimed to be doing in Tibet, where they felt that the old aristocratic and religious authority in Tibet was crushing ordinary Tibetans, and they were getting rid of that and allowing ordinary Tibetans the freedom to control their own lives. They didn't ask the Tibetans if they wanted this done on their behalf, but from their point of view, they didn't have to ask.
There was never any question the Tibetan army could defeat or could hold up a Chinese invasion. They did, however, put up a very brave show. They were fighting for the Dalai Lama, for their country, for their independence.
The Chinese overwhelmed the Tibetans. They slaughtered them. And when they marched into Lhasa in September of 1951, there was no opposition to speak of. They had taken the country whole hog.
The Tibetans themselves must bear some of the blame. Never was there, from the Tibetan government, a firm statement of its independence. They always were looking both ways.
As China redrew its maps, half of the Tibetan homeland disappeared into neighboring Chinese provinces. What was left was renamed the Tibet Autonomous Region.
In Mandarin, Tibet is Shizang, which means Western Treasure House, and the vast animal, mineral, and forest reserves that are on the Tibetan Plateau had great appeal to the Chinese communists. Tibet had immense strategic value to China. By controlling the high ground, literally at the heart of Asia, the apex of the Orient, you could dominate the continent.
The five-starred red flag of our motherland flutters high over Lhasa. Under the great banner of our motherland, the Tibetan people advanced to a new and better life.
The Dalai Lama, who was 15 at the time, attempted to cobble together some type of compromise with the Chinese invaders. And his logic at the time, very accurately, was that he should do everything he could to ameliorate the effect of occupation on the Tibetan people.
The Beijing government took over military and foreign affairs, but promised to allow Tibet's religious and political institutions to remain. In 1954, Tibet's highest-ranking religious leaders, the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama, accepted a Chinese invitation to visit Beijing, where they met with Mao Zedong. The Dalai Lama felt the Marxist ideals of equality and social justice might mesh well with Buddhist beliefs. He was impressed with the industrial progress of the Chinese. But his hopes for a constructive relationship with Communist China were dashed when during their last meeting Mao told him religion is poison.
When the Chinese first came to Tibet, they were very nice. They were pretending to be good. When the Tibetans went to get water, they helped us to carry that heavy water. When we were working on the farm, they helped us when we were totally exhausted. They repaired our shoes. We all thought the Chinese were lovers of religion. They said they were just guests and would be leaving soon. They just wanted to help us. And if they saw us happy, then they would be happy. Like that, they lied to us.
Once the Tibetan army had surrendered, part of the policy of the Chinese Communist Army was not to pillage and loot. You don't antagonize them unnecessarily when you're establishing your control. There was a period when they sought the reluctant cooperation of the Tibetans.
Implementing communist reforms, the Chinese army began seizing land and property in eastern Tibet and redistributing it to the peasants, much as they had done throughout China.
Problem was, when the Chinese went to a Tibetan village, the landlords were the clergy. And when they attacked the clergy for being parasites because they didn't work and lived off the labor of the others, the people didn't respond in the same way as they would if the army had arrested a rather venial landlord.
When the attacks became apparent on their religion, when the monks were held up to ridicule, when restrictions were put on the monasteries, people became more fearful and began to see the reality of Chinese communism.
They took a rope like this, and then they tied the Lama like this and that. They peed and defecated and threw their urine and stool on the Lama. It greatly saddened us. They raided all the wealth of our ancestors. The Chinese said there is no religion. There is no God. There are no spirits.
For us Tibetans, we want to preserve everything that Lord Buddha has said, which is the essence of our life. Since it is like taking our soul from the body, we couldn't stand it, and that's why we formed a resistance force against them, to save our religion.
Tensions mounted as Chinese battles with the Tibetan resistance took place ever nearer to Lhasa. Refugees from the violence in eastern Tibet were arriving by the thousands with shocking accounts of Chinese brutality. By March of 1959, the situation was explosive.
When it was believed that there was a threat to the life of His Holiness, the monasteries decided to raise a volunteer army of monks in case they were needed.
Taking up arms and fighting does go against a monk's vows. We put aside our vows and prepared to oppose them and to die fighting. This was done for the future survival of Buddha's teachings, our community, and our culture.
The Dalai Lama knew that Tibetans would fight to the death to protect him. He later wrote that he felt there was only one way to avoid massive loss of life. Disguised as a common soldier, the Dalai Lama slipped out of the palace at night and began the long, dangerous escape over the Himalayas to India. Days later, the Chinese army bombed the Dalai Lama's palace, and Tibetans across the country erupted in revolt. The Tibetan uprising was crushed, and became the justification for a ruthless crackdown against all resistance to Chinese rule in Tibet.
The figures are roughly 87,000 Tibetans killed in the winter of 1959 alone in central Tibet. After the repression of that revolt, Tibet was entirely sealed from the outside world for a period of a quarter century. During this quarter century, immense suffering occurred to the Tibetan people.
In 1960, the International Commission of Jurists, an independent human rights organization, concluded that China was guilty of committing genocide in Tibet. The Commission's report found evidence that murder, arbitrary imprisonment, and torture were inflicted on the Tibetans on a large scale, and that children were indoctrinated to turn against their parents and reject their religion and customs.
Examples from real life teach these children the distinction between good people and bad people.
The spread of communist doctrine in Asia provoked the United States to seek new alliances in the Cold War.
American involvement with the Tibetan cause began as a covert involvement with the CIA training of Tibetan guerrillas in the early 50s. Tibetans were flown secretly across the Pacific, covertly trained at Camp Hale, Colorado, in mountain warfare, and then shipped back to Asia.
The training they gave us was guerrilla warfare, communication, ammunition, and parachutes.
The older generation, they're not just coming from one country to another country. It's from one age to another age. We were thrown across 3 centuries. And they didn't understand how the modern world worked. And we thought it was in our interest to keep everything secret. So we fought a secret war.
Barley is the staple grain of the Tibetan plateau, but Mao Zedong ordered the Tibetans to plant wheat, which was favored in China. The wheat crop failed in Tibet's harsh climate. According to Chinese statistics, in some areas of Tibet, nearly 50% of the population starved to death. Mao's disastrous agricultural policies led to the deaths of an estimated 30 million Chinese between 1959 and 1962, more than Stalin's purges and the Nazi Holocaust combined.
Tibet was cloaked by a wall of propaganda. China portrayed Tibet as a socialist paradise on the roof of the world, and in fact, hundreds of thousands of Tibetans were dying.
This is the first time in thousands of years that the Tibetan peasants are able to grow crops for themselves. The oppression and exploitation which the Tibetan peasants suffered for centuries have now been relegated to the past. In truth, springtime has come to Tibet.
The figures for the loss of life for all of Tibet since the occupation started are 1.2 million, which is 1 out of every 6 Tibetans, and they died as a result not just of armed conflict, but of starvation and imprisonment as well.
Prisons where Tibetan resistors had been sentenced to hard labor became death camps.
Thousands of people were lined up and posters tied around their necks describing their crimes, and then they were taken to be killed. One by one, they were made to stand on the edge of a pit and shot and covered with dirt even before the person stopped breathing. I have never felt so sad as those days.
100 of us were taken to the factory. We became like family and came to love and care for each other. From 100 women in their 20s, only 4 managed to survive. All the others died of starvation. In the whole world, I can't imagine such suffering. There was nothing there but bones. Our eyes had sunken. We didn't dare look at each other. They cried and groaned for a while and then died.
Adi saved a piece of cloth from each of her friends' clothing, which she stitched into a quilt.
I wanted to keep it with me to show to others, to tell them how much we suffered. Whenever I am sleeping on my bed in my house, with great comfort, I always think of the space in the prison and all my friends there. I pray that those who died will never have to suffer like that, ever again.
Buddhists basically believe in the dominance of benevolent power in the universe. That the force of evil is an accident, is ignorance, is based on error and therefore ultimately weaker. This sense of the faith in goodness that the Buddhist has is very crucial to making them not become cynical and not to become despair.
In 1966, Mao Zedong launched the Cultural Revolution, declaring that a new modern China would gloriously arise by the destruction of everything old.
The Cultural Revolution, that 10-year period when Chinese went mad in destroying their own cultural traditions. I don't think it ever happened in any other society that the powerful minds as well as dedicated youth to say that we have to get rid of our past. Our past symbolizes backwardness, symbolizes feudalism, superstition. And Tibet was totally brutalized with that kind of mentality.
The 6,254 monasteries that were the living repositories of over a millennia of higher Tibetan civilization were destroyed. Their treasures were shipped to China or melted down into bullion or bullets. All the scriptures were burned. Wood was literally taken from the monasteries to be used in the construction of Chinese military camps. And then the buildings themselves were dynamited and subjected to artillery shelling by the PLA. What looks like 500-year-old ruins literally pocking the landscape, every single valley. They're not 500 years old. They were destroyed during the Cultural Revolution.
Tibetan monasteries were like your universities, like your libraries, like your museums. So when we talk about the destruction of more than 6,000 monasteries, we're not just talking about destruction of 6,000 places of worship. We're talking about destruction of Tibet's entire culture, its civilization.
The Tibetan guerrillas continued to fight to save their homeland. For 20 years, the CIA had supported the Tibetan fighters. Now that aid was drying up. The United States shifted its policy and sought an alliance with Communist China against the growing influence of the Soviet Union.
After Henry Kissinger secretly flew to Beijing in August of '71, and as the story goes, was told by the Chinese, the first thing you do if you want better relations with the People's Republic is to pull the plug on your Tibet operation. At that point, the funding from the CIA completely dried up.
Our leaders at that time did not realize America never really entertained any ideas of helping support the Tibetan independence struggle. It was partially to just harass Communist Chinese. So it is said that we were given enough help to harass, but not enough to win.
I spied for America from 1960 to 1973. I served the USA's interests for more than a decade, but at the last minute, they more or less betrayed us. That was a big, shocking experience.
Some of our leaders committed suicide. They couldn't surrender the struggle. They had taken a vow.
But what's so unique about the Tibetan experience and so compelling, in many ways, is what the refugees have done outside of Tibet. They made the decision to fight for their country constructively, non-violently. That was their idea, and it was, of course, His Holiness's inspiration behind it. and very much in keeping with the Buddhist ethos of the Tibetan civilization, to fight nonviolently. And they created a cultural embryo of Tibetan civilization through the creation of a school system so that their children would be raised as Tibetans with full knowledge of their culture and history and language. They created institutions of higher learning, embodying the full scope of higher Tibetan civilization. By preserving their culture, they would eventually create a kind of living refutation of the Chinese claims on Tibet.
Nearly 3,000 Tibetans each year risk their lives escaping over the treacherous Himalayan passes into an uncertain future. It takes weeks, sometimes months, to reach Dharamsala, India, where the Dalai Lama established the Tibetan government in exile. New refugees are often treated for exposure, malnutrition, and frostbite. Victims of torture receive special medical and psychological care. Most of these new refugees are young, unable to get a job or join a monastery in their homeland. Some are fleeing political persecution. Some simply wish to receive the blessing of their beloved Dalai Lama before they die.
People inside Tibet today suffer a form of racism which has reduced the Tibetans to second-class citizens in our own country. And therefore, the official language is Chinese. The children have to learn Chinese if they are to get any education. And people who do not know Chinese have no scope of getting any proper jobs.
The Chinese are saying that if you study the Tibetan language, it is a religious language. It is a language whose time has passed already. And so, if you want to develop the country and learn science, then you have to learn the Chinese language.
In Lhasa, schools now charge tuition, between $250 and $400 per child, more than the average Tibetan's annual salary. To ensure a Tibetan education, an increasing number of families defy Chinese law and bring their children to Dharamsala for schooling. Over 11,000 children are currently being cared for in Tibetan children's villages in exile.
Our generation of Tibetans, what we are saying is that we cannot trust the lives of our children into the hands of the people who killed our parents. What little faith the Tibetans in Tibet have in what the Chinese government says, their promises and assurances, how uncertain their life and their future is, that parents will surrender their children, leave here, go back. Maybe they will see them in some years, maybe never to see again. So one day, these children must meet their mothers. There should be no border, there should be no restrictions, there must be freedom for these children and for these young mothers to meet each other. That is a promise I have.
I feel the outside world has a great lack of knowledge or understanding about Tibet. Some filmmakers have depicted the Dalai Lama as the standard bearer of human rights. I feel that is not accurate. Before 1959, the policies he pursued and defended in Tibet are much darker and crueler than the Negro slavery system in the United States before the Civil War. Since 1959, China has made progress in all areas, including human rights, in Tibet.
When Mao Zedong died in 1976, the nightmare of the Cultural Revolution ended for the Chinese people. For the first time in 25 years, the Tibetans held hope for their future when the new leadership contacted the Dalai Lama to discuss his possible return from exile.
The Dalai Lama said, of course we would like to talk. First, we would like to recontact our people, who we have not had any direct relations with since the government fled in '59, and to do that, we'd like to send a fact-finding delegation. The Chinese were highly confident that they would be impressed by what they found in Tibet, and that the Chinese side of the story would be well served by these delegations from the exile government visiting Tibet. In fact, the exact opposite happened. The first three delegations crisscrossed the country, and in every place they were met by mobs, hordes of people who came out by the tens of thousands, weeping hysterically, literally tearing the clothes off the delegates' backs, begging, pleading with them to tell the Dalai Lama of their suffering under 25 years of Chinese occupation. Very heartbreaking, very upsetting, very, very profoundly shocking to the Tibetans in exile to see the impoverished people that came out in each town and city. And eventually the situation got so out of control that the Chinese killed the delegation diplomacy, period, and prohibited further delegations from visiting Tibet.
Compelled to turn to the outside world for support, the Dalai Lama journeyed abroad, giving Buddhist teachings and speaking out on behalf of his people. His inspiring messages attracted the attention of influential writers, scientists, artists, and politicians worldwide.
As a Buddhist practitioner, most important practice is practice of compassion and love. Compassion means they not only concern about that person, but also you have some kind of sense of responsibility and sense of commitment. That is the genuine compassion. So now, in order to develop compassion, the most severe obstacle for that is hatred. So in order to reduce hatred, patience is the main sort of antidote. The enemy or the people or the person who creates trouble for you is, from one aspect, as the best teacher.
The Dalai Lama, he astounds people in international forums when he verbally and vigorously denounces the genocide by the Chinese in Tibet, and in the same breath he says, "But I do not hate the Chinese. I feel sorry for those who are committing acts of violence as ordered by their superiors or as stimulated in it by being caught within a sort of emotional sea of a riot or a violent situation. They become completely dehumanized. I feel sorry for them."
In 1987, the Dalai Lama was invited by members of the United States Congress to address the Human Rights Caucus. He presented a 5-point peace plan for Tibet.
The future Tibet must be a zone of peace. In the past, Tibet acted as a buffer state. So since Chinese invasion, since the Chinese stationed a lot of Chinese army in Tibet, then you see the situation on that continent completely changed. So in future, Tibet create as a demilitarized a zone of peace and can be tremendous benefit for all those states there.
He said that Tibet would consider having some sort of autonomous status under the purview of the People's Republic of China. China could retain the portfolios of defense and foreign affairs, but the Tibetans required internal autonomy.
He's talking about autonomy, not independence. That is a major concession. He's talking about Tibet controlling its own domestic life. He's not talking about military or foreign affairs issues, which could be left to the Chinese.
The Chinese government is firmly opposed to his visits to other countries and giving speeches, distorting the history and the current situation in Tibet, and advocating the independence of Tibet. So it is totally unacceptable to the Chinese government for officials of any country to meet him in any form.
According to the Indian government, there are approximately 300,000 troops stationed in Tibet, enforcing the Chinese occupation.
Tibet separates the two most populous nations on the planet, China and India. These nations are nuclear, they're impoverished, they represent between them almost half the human race. If you have them faced off, as they have been since the Chinese invasion of Tibet, you've pulled the linchpin of peace at the heart of Asia.
Whoever controls Tibet dominates the rest of Asia. You've got all the periphery countries, China, Burma, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan. At the center of all this is Tibet. And this is why I'm so attracted to the proposal of His Holiness to have a peace zone.
The Dalai Lama, as a world leader, offers a different perspective on world events, on national decisions, a perspective that values nonviolence, a perspective that does not consider military solutions to be effective.
It is due to the Dalai Lama's leadership that Tibetans have not resorted to the kinds of terrorism which have become common in other parts of the world.
The non-violent method is the firstly human way, and secondly, this method, while achieving our own goal, there will not be any side effect on the masses of Chinese. And though it may take time, so we need more determination, more willpower, or patience also.
In 1989, the Dalai Lama's efforts to lead a nonviolent struggle for justice for the Tibetan people earned him one of the world's most distinguished honors, the Nobel Peace Prize.
I accept it on behalf of the 6 million Tibetan people, my brave countrymen and women inside Tibet, who have suffered and continue to suffer so much. Ours has been a long struggle. We know our cause is just. Because violence can only breed more violence and suffering, our struggle must remain non-violent and free of hatred.
We have to understand in the Western terms what His Holiness is to Tibetans. Imagine what a Christian community would be like if the concept of their community was not that their Savior had been sacrificed long ago and would someday come back, in some vague future, but that their savior was right there, continuously reincarnated with them and sort of watching over them attentively, and also requiring from them a positive response at all times. Imagine how that would change the quality of life, the sense of the immediacy of their religious ideals and the presence of their religious energies. It would affect people very strongly.
When His Holiness was awarded the Nobel Prize, there was no end to our happiness. We realized there was a market for peace and nonviolent struggle. We were optimistic that truth would prevail, and peace and justice would come to the Tibetans.
In Tibet, celebration of the Dalai Lama's Nobel Prize was banned, and as denunciations against him intensified, so did demonstrations against Chinese rule.
That demonstration in the Jokang, we covered that area. We saw a lot of destruction by the Chinese soldiers, but we could not report what we saw and what we heard. We feel like we are prisoners. We have the freedom to move around, but our minds are imprisoned. Whenever there is unrest happening in Tibet, I really wish that I could report the news. But at the same time, I also saw that if we covered any of this, those pictures eventually became the evidence for the security forces to arrest people.
I was grabbed by 3 Chinese. As soon as we were put in the truck, we were beaten. They used the butts of the rifles and tied our hands behind us.
We were not only beaten, we were made to take off all of our clothes and lay face down on the cement floor.
They said, "You are dirty," so they put on gloves and face masks. And then they told us we were prostitutes who chased after monks.
I didn't know if it was day or night. I was confused. They beat us until we were like corpses.
When they stuck the electric cattle prod in my vagina, something happened in my heart, and then I fell unconscious.
The torture methods they use are truly inconceivable, beyond your imagination. Really, if you could see what happens, there is no way to control your tears.
The Tibetans who are tortured are often those who are most committed to the preservation of the values of the Buddhist tradition. They are prepared to undergo all kinds of horrendous hardship in order that those values not be compromised or sacrificed. And that, I think, tells us a great deal about the power of Buddhist practice in their lives, that they have not broken under pressure, that they hold on to values that are more important and more potent for them than any kind of threats that the Chinese can throw at them. Because they say often that although the Chinese can torture my body, they cannot torture my soul.
One of the key ideas, of course, in Buddhism is the idea of karma. It gives the individual a sense of infinite interconnectedness with everything. And the individual person now is born a Tibetan. In a previous life they were born a Chinese. In a previous life they were born an American. In a previous life they were born a dog. It is how they are able to, even after being beaten to death practically by some Chinese, actually not to hate a Chinese. Karma theory shows the individual as interconnected with all things.
After 15 years of imprisonment, Pauline Gyatso was sent to a labor camp, where he collaborated on pro-independence pamphlets and posters with the scholar Geshe Lobsang Wongchuk.
Because of these activities, I was once again arrested in 1983 and put in prison for another 9 years. Electric cattle prods were used on me many times. They used it often in my mouth.
Geshe Wangchuk wrote a book entitled The History of the Independence of Tibet. He was tortured to death. When Palden Gyatso was finally released in 1992, he had been incarcerated for 33 years. At great risk, he arranged to smuggle torture implements from prison and escape from Tibet, determined to tell the world of the suffering in his homeland.
I can say that this is what I personally experienced, these tortures, and I can even give you the date, times, and in fact, names of the torturers who inflicted these things on me.
Human right is something very, very important. Freedom is our basic right from our birth. I think it is our moral responsibility to help those people who are still under authoritarian regime.
In the spring of 1989, students massed by the tens of thousands in Beijing's Tiananmen Square to demand democratic freedoms.
I think Tiananmen was much more a threat to China than the leaders wanted to let on. And I think a decision was made to crush it at any cost.
They are very much afraid of the breaking up of China. It's like a domino effect. If there's a loss of control in Tibet, there will be similar loss of control in Xinjiang, in Inner Mongolia, and in other minority groups. The Chinese government saw the breakup of Soviet Union as a negative lesson, as something they will do everything to prevent from happening in China.
Amnesty International estimates that over 1,000 protesters and bystanders were killed by the guns of their own army.
I saw for the first time that the Chinese people, like us, were capable of being hurt. They're capable to cry. You see, they felt the same, pain and suffering that, we've been feeling for so long. And they had the same desire just as we did. They're talking about freedom. They're talking about democracy.
International outrage over Tiananmen Square was soon lost in the rush of businesses scrambling to gain access to China's vast emerging market. Pressure on Beijing to improve its human rights record was replaced by a policy of constructive engagement with China.
We welcome and support China's accession to the World Trade Organization. And in the long run, the advance of Chinese prosperity depends on China's full integration into the rules and norms of international institutions.
We have seen a natural entrepreneurial instinct of Chinese people come to bear in developing what can be a very strong economic democracy. It is impossible to develop an economic democracy without social democracy coming short behind.
Now, the business community would lead you to believe that trade in and of itself and economic development bring democracy. What builds democracy is human freedom, civil society, free and independent trade unions, and not money.
By the year 2000, the U.S. was China's largest trading partner, buying nearly half of China's worldwide exports, which has resulted in a trade deficit of $87 billion in China's favor. Many Chinese consumer products filling American shelves are produced by factories owned and operated by the People's Liberation Army.
The PLA not only suppresses its own people, but it suppresses the people of Tibet, and we are directly subsidizing that repression. We have raised capital for the People's Liberation Army on Wall Street. Mao must be just sort of laughing in his grave.
But people ask me, what does it mean for Tibet? That's not the question. What does it mean to your country, to your values, to your principles, the land of the free and home of the brave. Stooping down to this murderous dictatorship which has lost the confidence of its own people.
The Chinese run a very, very large and sophisticated propaganda operation. The Tibetans have gotten more sophisticated, but they're small. It is easy for the Chinese to portray people who are sympathetic with Tibet as religious fanatics, as New Agers, as people who are on the fringes of popular opinion, whereas China is a big, important international country, and they appeal to the political and economic mainstream.
I think big business is cornering the market in many ways on U.S.-China policy. People who have been fighting for human rights and democracy in China and Tibet are now up against a much bigger force than they ever were before. In the years to come, the China lobby in this country will be so significantly tied into the Chinese government with billions and billions and billions of dollars worth of contracts that those few voices calling for democracy and human rights in that part of the world will have a hell of a time in Congress making their case heard.
Today, the Chinese who are coming to Tibet are not armed with guns or communist ideology, but with a capitalist appetite to strike it rich on the rooftop of the world. It is this latest wave of invasion which the Chinese have used to successfully conquer other regions that threatens to wipe out Tibetan identity altogether. The Beijing government offers incentives to entice Chinese settlers to move to Tibet.
Nowadays, lots of Chinese have moved to Tibet. All the jobs have been given to those Chinese. No jobs are left for Tibetans. Building workers are Chinese, carpenters are Chinese, restaurant workers are Chinese. Tibetans cannot get a job at all.
In my judgment, this allegation is totally unfounded and far-fetched. The Chinese are mainly specialized personnel and technical workers. They are working in Tibet to help develop the local economy and culture.
Unemployed young Tibetans are a common sight, passing their days playing pool or listlessly watching Chinese programs in grungy TV parlors.
The problem is, unfortunately, that Tibet is not a part of China. It never has been. And the Chinese don't regard Tibetans as Chinese. Their language sounds barbaric to them, the way they dress, their religious fervor seems some fanatical and crazy to the Chinese. The Chinese person who is sent to Tibet, they have this terrible disillusioning experiences. They go up there and they say, we come to help you. Then they look at these people and they say, wait a minute, you're not Chinese. Oh, you don't like me helping you. Oh, you don't even identify. We can't even talk the same language.
As evidence of China's efforts to preserve Tibetan culture, the Beijing government boasts of spending millions of dollars on the restoration of the Potala Palace. Tibetan pilgrims must stand in line and buy tickets along with foreign tourists to visit this holy site.
Potala Palace was a living monastery inhabited by human beings, which was being used daily for prayers, which is being used as a school. It was also the living quarters for the Dalai Lama, but it was also housed in many government departments. Today it is just already a museum piece. The whole of Tibet will become like Potala Palace, just a little piece in the museum, so that people can, just sort of admire, say that, oh, once there was great civilization called the Tibetan civilization.
Tibetans are powerless to oppose what many fear may be Beijing's final solution for Tibet, a controversial multi-billion-dollar railroad which will enable China to permanently colonize and control the strategic Himalayan region.
As to the life of the Tibetans, I think the building of this railway will have a positive impact rather than a negative one. Local people will be able, for example, to get more construction material and food. It'll be good also for the local job market. So I don't see any bad things for the local people.
At a certain point, numbers simply overwhelm the indigenous people. They become marginalized. A kind of Asian apartheid occurs in which you have a reservation group living in an impoverished condition with no education and no job prospects, surrounded by a dominant economy of colonial structure. And that's what's happening in Tibet very successfully, and it's threatening the very roots of 1,300 years of higher Tibetan civilization.
This is another form of genocide. You see, this way, the ethnic, the local people will assimilate it into this newcomer, and with that, the whole culture and whole sort of identity then disappear.
In 1995, the Dalai Lama identified 6-year-old Gendin Choki Nyima as the reincarnated Panchen Lama, Tibet's second most revered spiritual leader. The boy and his family disappeared within days of the Dalai Lama's announcement.
The Chinese have arrested and imprisoned the Dalai Lama's choice of Panchen Lama. He's now the youngest political prisoner in the world, isolated in Beijing under house arrest.
Chinese authorities appointed their choice of Panchen Lama. They want the Panchen Lama under their control because it is he, according to tradition, who will recognize the next incarnation of the Dalai Lama.
The fact that the Chinese insist on appointing their own candidate as the Panchen Lama shows to what lengths they will go to impose their authority over the Tibetan people. It's blatantly absurd that a Communist Party official would appoint a reincarnate Lama. To see this happening exposes the enormous gulf between the aspirations of the Tibetan people and the political will of the Chinese.
Beijing has not allowed any international agency to confirm that Gendin Choki Nyima is alive.
It's my understanding that the United Nations is supposed to look after the welfare of the world. The United Nations stands for helping defenseless nations. Why don't they help us?
Why doesn't the United Nations want to listen to the Dalai Lama, the embodiment of peace and non-violence? They want to listen to Yasser Arafat. All leaders in the world are talking about peace, but nobody is doing anything about it. Everyone is condemning violence, but nobody is doing anything to support non-violence.
Frustrated by the indifference of the United Nations, a growing number of Tibetans have begun to question the Dalai Lama's policy of strict non-violence.
Tibetans must create a whole area and a period of instability inside Tibet, to a point that no Chinese would want to immigrate to Tibet. And even the immigrants there that are living there would want to go back to China.
If we cannot demonstratively show that his path of nonviolence is being given credit, that he is being respected for what he stands for, then the people can become restless. Then the people can resort into violence.
People who have always preached nonviolence have realized that in this instance, nonviolence is not the answer.
desperate effort to bring attention to the Tibetan cause, Troop 10 Nodup, a former monk, committed what for most Tibetans was an unthinkable act.
Our struggle is not for a piece of land, it is for a way of life. It is for a culture, it is for a civilization which teaches us that life in the form of a human being is the most precious.
I do not feel our non-violent method fail. It's a long run. Because of our non-violent, nature struggle, many Chinese now showing their sympathy and their concern.
Many people have talked to me and said, there are so many problems faced by the Chinese people. Why are you spending your time to also talk about the Tibetan issue? My answer is that this is not a question simply for the Tibetan people. This is a question for all people who see such human rights abuses. This is a problem for all of us living today on this earth.
China needs to heal its own suffering, its own humiliation, its own wound because of its brutality towards its own culture, towards its own past. In that healing process, China will recognize that Buddhism is a major spiritual resource. Once China recognizes Buddhism is an integral part of the Chinese soul, then Tibet will be a major resource for China. And Dalai Lama will be a major figure, a Chinese leader, spiritual leader, not the separatist, but someone who is able to underscore a dimension of Chinese spirituality for various reasons that Chinese have forgotten.
Now, this moment, I think we really need the genuine sense of the global responsibility based on entire humanity as same member of one human family. Your American ancestors, like I said, Lincoln or Jefferson, I think they stood firmly on moral principle. I not admire your weapon. I really admire your principle, democracy, freedom, and liberty. Now, your policy, I think, must guide it with these things. So, let American people's heart speak.
These are some of the actual tools of torture that were used in the prison camps where I was interred. These were smuggled out of Tibet. In fact, I brought them with me myself. These are the ones that are used.
We must never give in to the idea that it's hopeless or impossible. The people forced the government not to do business with South Africa, and look and behold, it succeeded. Everyone would have said that the Berlin Wall would never go down. And look at what happened. Russia changed, which was every bit as impossible in people's mind as China letting go of Tibet. Tibet can be free. All it takes is our will joined together, demanding that it be so. And it can happen.
My basic attitude always remain optimistic. So I consider pessimism is the seed of failure. In spite of many difficulties, obstacles, we must remain with hope, with determination.
even at this dark moment, even as bleak as the situation is today, why I still believe Tibet can be free is because of the people. After all these years of suffering and oppression, the people inside Tibet have not lost the hope and the courage to be free.
Consider this, the hint of the century. Consider
As long as I'm breathing, as long as I have blood running in my veins, I will never stop fighting for the freedom of Tibet.
Long live the Dalai Lama! Free the Panchen Lama and all the Tibetan and Chinese political prisoners. Free Tibet!
This rich ancient civilization, which is part of the entire human heritage and has something to offer. His Holiness has put that very succinctly, where he said, while the Western world was exploring the outer space, we were exploring the inner space. For centuries, our best minds, our saints and our philosophers concentrated all their time and energy to understanding the nature of the mind. And who can say which would really matter in the end? The landing on the moon or the understanding of the mind?
The Tibetans are not asking us to invade China and liberate Tibet by violence. They want to be liberated by knowledge. They want to be liberated by compassion, by information.
We do not ask that the West fight our battles for us. We do not ask that other people sacrifice their self-interest for ours. But I don't think it is too much to ask that Western leaders, the United Nations, and today America live up to the standards they proclaim. We want to be counted among ordinary human beings who only seek ordinary human rights. The right of all people to be free to determine their future. And there will be problems in Tibet, but we will solve them in our own way. And we will not be enemies with China. We could even be friends.
freedom, 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 freedom. Sometimes I feel like I'm a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like I'm a motherless child. Sometimes I feel just like I'm a motherless child, alone, way my own love. Sing freedom, 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 freedom. Sometimes I feel just like I'm almost gone. Sometimes I feel like I'm almost gone. Sometimes I feel just like I'm almost gone. Long way home, singing freedom, 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 freedom. Clap your hands, clap your hands, clap your hands. Come on, clap your hands, clap your hands, clap your hands, clap your hands. I got a telephone in my bosom, and I can call him up from my heart. I I got a telephone in my bosom, and I can call him up from my heart when I need my brother. I say brother when I need my father. I say father when I need my sister.